whatsoever in this cross-sectional survey to see if Native Hawaiians have different prevalence of disease than non-Native Hawaiians, say Caucasians or Filipinos, although Kiabe did mention those people were part of, I think, of the original study, but this second question was not meant to be tricky. It was just asking you to focus on the second bar from the left, the traditional group, and notice that their prevalence was roughly twice that or more than the other groups. And does that mean that that group is a high-risk group for developing diabetes? Or is there, or as the third bullet on this slide says, are there other explanations? Let me show you the slide again. I'll go back. And let's just focus on the first question, which was, again, how would you summarize this figure? So what would you take on as the take-home message? If we looked at Kiabe's paper in the results section, he didn't give any data whatsoever, any numbers. But if you wanted to summarize this, what would you say? Anybody who wants to make a numerical summary, just send it in by chat. I'll babble for another 20 seconds, and I'll give you my answer. Basically, we see that the prevalence is highest in this group, which self-report themselves as being of the traditional group. It's roughly twice as high as in the integrated group. My guess is, if you remember from last week, I said this was the hard part, measuring an outcome, measuring the prevalence of diabetes in the two groups. Easy part, if you want to measure the association between group membership and prevalence of diabetes, is you could either take the ratio of these two numbers, 27% or 28% divided by 15% is a ratio of about 1.8. You could say that participants in the traditional group, their prevalence of diabetes is 1.8 times that of the people in the integrated group. Or if you want, you could take the difference in those two numbers. 27.9 minus 15.4 is a difference of 12.5 percentage points. So the question is, which of those two measures would make more sense to you in terms of a summary value? To say that the people in the traditional group have roughly twice the prevalence of diabetes than people in the integrated group? Or would it be better to say that the prevalence of diabetes in the traditional group is about 12 percentage points higher? And I think it makes a distinction of whether you are trying to make any sort of a causal statement, and it's hard to make causal statements with cross-sectional data because you're dealing with prevalence, or if you're trying to make a study about the impact of a characteristic on a disease in terms of the burden on a society, the burden on the state of Hawaii. Because if I tell you that the traditional group has twice the prevalence as the integrated group, that's all I tell you, twice the prevalence. You don't know from that whether I'm doubling the prevalence and going from 1% to 2%, or 10% to 20%, or in this case, 15% up to about 30%. So in other words, a prevalence ratio doesn't give me any idea of the magnitude of the problem. All it tells me is that one group has twice the prevalence of another. On the other hand, a prevalence difference of 12.5 percentage points says if I have 1,000 people who self-report themselves to be of the traditional group, I have another 1,000 people who are in the integrated group, there's going to be 125 extra cases of diabetes in the traditional group versus the integrated group. So the difference measure does give you a measure of the burden of group membership on the prevalence of disease. So if you were the Secretary of Health for the state of Hawaii, trying to figure out how to spend money and spend resources to try somehow address the burden of diabetes in your state, a difference measure might be a very useful metric to consider because it captures the magnitude, the number of cases, number of extra cases, 125 extra cases for every extra 1,000 people in the traditional mode rather than the integrated mode. But if you're trying to describe the impact, the effect in terms of a causal mechanism, more often than not we use ratio measures. But both of them can be considered depending on what the purpose of the summary is. Well, that was the first question, but let's talk about the second question. I mentioned that this slide is looking at prevalence of diabetes. We notice that the individuals who self-reported themselves to be of the traditional group have a higher prevalence than people in the integrated group. And the question is, does that mean that if you're in the traditional group, you're at higher risk to begin with of developing diabetes? Can we make any conclusion about risk of developing diabetes from cross-sectional data like this, from when we're dealing with prevalence rather than incidence? So that's the next question I want you to think about. Chad said not to digress, but what was the significant association between acculturation and educational level mentioned in this paper? How was educational levels distributed between the two acculturation groups? Kiave, I'm going to ask you to come back on in a minute, but that's a good question. That is actually one of the points I want to raise in about 3 slides from now. So let's hold that in our mind for a minute. But now let's focus back on the question of, can we, from this slide, conclude that the traditional group is higher risk because they have higher prevalence? Or as the third bullet says, are there another reason that you might find a group with higher prevalence than another group? But the reason is not because that first group was at a higher risk of developing disease and the other one was not. And basically, whenever you have cross-sectional data, there are always 3 very likely plausible explanations for seeing an association like we see. All we know is that the traditional people have higher prevalence. There's more diabetes among them. And one reason there might be more diabetes among them is because they are at higher risk of developing diabetes. Diabetes occur more often among people who practice a traditional lifestyle, for example, and compared to people in the integrated group. But another possible explanation is that prevalence is a function, as I mentioned last week, of both incidence and duration. Maybe the people who develop diabetes in the traditional group live with their diabetes much longer. They receive better care, while the people in the integrated group die at a much higher rate of disease. Diabetes kills them off at a higher rate. And therefore, when we come along with our survey and take a snapshot of this population, maybe some of the diabetics in the traditional group were diagnosed many, many, many years ago and have survived with their disease. But in the integrated group, people who were diagnosed many, many, many years ago may no longer be around, may have succumbed to that disease, or they might have moved away from these communities, and therefore you no longer have these long duration people. So another reason for the excess prevalence in the traditional group is perhaps acculturation has something to do with duration of disease, something to do with treatment of disease. And then finally, a third plausible explanation you always have to consider with cross-sectional data is what came first, the chicken or the egg? All we know is that people who practice and live a traditional acculturation lifestyle have higher prevalence. Is that because people living that lifestyle, people living in those beliefs, are higher risk of developing diabetes? Or if you develop diabetes, did you change your lifestyle? Because I don't believe anything Kiave has in his survey questionnaire was asking about acculturation modes that existed 5 years ago, 10 years ago. He was asking about where you classify yourself today. And that might have been different from where you classified yourself a year ago or 5 years ago. And maybe the fact that you developed diabetes has changed your lifestyle. So there's always possibilities when you have cross-sectional studies of 3 plausible explanations for an association. And therefore, they're not great studies to look at if you're trying to measure the association between a risk factor and the incidence of disease, whether a particular lifestyle increases your risk of developing diabetes. So we'll talk about incidence studies in a minute, but let me move on, and I'm going to ask you guys a few other questions. And these questions are dealing again with this study, but they're going to point to stuff we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. And what I want to talk about today is at least introduce the notion of possible biases in this study. Let me see if I can get the clicker to work. I want to talk about biases. And if I remember correctly, one folks, Joseph, somebody asked a question about education. I forget who it was. and that comes under the heading of confounding. So let me ask you guys a few other questions before we leave GABA's study.